A moment of suspicion. Lena Carter had always been a person who thrived on the energy of a busy airport. She'd flown countless times, each journey filled with purpose and a bit of excitement. Today was no different. The quiet thrum of her nerves was mixed with the anticipation of what lay ahead, a critical business meeting that could change the trajectory of her startup. She was the founder of a tech company, a venture she had poured her soul into for the last 5 years, and now, she was on the brink of securing major funding from a group of investors. This was the moment she had worked so hard for. The morning sun streamed in through the high glass windows of the terminal, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Lena had dressed for success, her dark blue blazer crisp and perfectly fitted over a simple white blouse. Her black trousers were tailored to perfection, and her hair, pulled back into a neat bun, framed her face with sharp professionalism. She stood tall, shoulders squared, radiating the confidence that came with knowing she was in control of her destiny. Her carry-on bag was slung over her shoulder, weighty with the materials she would need for her meeting, the business proposal, projections, and contracts that could make or break her future. As she approached Gate 19, her steps were measured, her posture poised. She'd passed through security without incident, the usual checks were a mere formality. She knew the routine well and had long ago perfected the art of flying as a professional. As Lena neared the gate, she glanced at the flight board. It read, "On time." Perfect. Just the way she liked things to go. She took her place in line, waiting for her turn to present her boarding pass. The gate agent, a young man with a bored expression and half-closed eyes, greeted each passenger with the same level of indifference. But when Lena stepped forward, she felt the slightest shift in the air, something subtle but unmistakable. The agent's eyes scanned her boarding pass, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary. She gave him a polite smile, but he didn't return it. Instead, he looked at her pass again and then back at her, his gaze narrowing slightly. Lena's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. It wasn't unusual for boarding passes to get flagged for minor issues, like the time she had accidentally booked a flight with an incorrect middle name. This was likely a similar misunderstanding. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside," the agent said, his voice low but steady. His words weren't overtly threatening, but the way he said them set off an alarm in Lena's mind. Something wasn't right. "Excuse me," she asked, her tone even, but now with a trace of confusion. The other passengers in line had stopped talking, their heads turning subtly in her direction. She could feel their gaze, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "There's an issue with your boarding pass," he explained, still looking at the screen in front of him, but his fingers tapping nervously on the keys. "It's been flagged as suspicious. I'll need to call security." Lena's heart skipped a beat. Suspicious? Why? What could possibly be suspicious about a routine flight from New York to San Francisco? She had all her documents in order, and there was no reason for this. She felt the familiar sense of control slip away, replaced by a mounting sense of dread. I don't understand," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "What do you mean, suspicious?" The agent didn't answer right away. Instead, he spoke into his headset, requesting assistance. His voice was calm, but there was an undertone of uncertainty. He wasn't sure himself, but he was following protocol. Lena tried to steady her breathing, her mind racing. "Please wait here," the agent finally said, his eyes briefly meeting hers. He turned and walked away, moving quickly toward a small office behind the gate. Lena stood frozen for a moment, a heavy silence settling over her. The shuffle of passengers around her seemed to blur into the background. A dozen questions ran through her mind. Was it a mistake? Had someone tried to use her identity? Did she somehow end up on a list for some reason she couldn't even begin to understand? The seconds felt like minutes. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her. Passengers glanced her way, some with curiosity, others with judgment already beginning to settle in their expressions. A woman nearby whispered something to her companion, and though Lena couldn't hear the words, she could guess the sentiment. It wasn't hard to imagine the assumptions people were making. A black woman, flying to a high-profile business meeting, flagged as suspicious. It wasn't lost on Lena that there was far more to this than a simple misunderstanding. Her eyes darted around the terminal, her mind scanning for any sign of what might be happening. She didn't recognize anyone, but she did notice that the mood in the terminal had shifted. There was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle unease rippling through the crowd as they waited to see what would happen next. Lena tried to focus on the task at hand. She had no time for this. The meeting she was traveling for was crucial. The investors had already expressed their interest, and her team had worked tirelessly to prepare. This wasn't just another pitch, it was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She couldn't afford to let something like this derail everything. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she instinctively reached for it. The message was from her assistant, Emily. "Are you on the plane yet? The meeting starts in 2 hours. They're waiting for you." Lena quickly typed a response, "Not yet. Something's wrong with the boarding pass. I'll keep you updated." She stuffed the phone back into her pocket, but the buzz of anxiety inside her continued to rise. She had to remain calm. This could all be cleared up quickly. She had to believe that. Minutes passed, stretching on endlessly. She stood off to the side, her arms crossed in front of her as she leaned against the cold metal railing. The gate agent had disappeared into the office with her boarding pass, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Lena tried to maintain her poise, to breathe deeply and stay centered, but it wasn't easy. A group of passengers had gathered near the gate, and a few of them exchanged glances, their quiet whispers reaching Lena's ears. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was impossible to ignore the feeling that she was being scrutinized, even if no one was saying anything directly to her. The gate agent returned, now accompanied by a uniformed security officer. The officer was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, and he immediately started speaking to the gate agent in low tones. Lena could feel her pulse quicken as she stood there, alone in this small, increasingly uncomfortable world. The agent turned toward her, his face unreadable now. "Ma'am, we're going to need to conduct a more thorough check of your documents," he said, his voice clipped and formal. Lena nodded stiffly, trying to keep her composure. She knew that the situation was about to escalate, but she refused to let fear take hold of her. There was something else at play here, something deeper than just a miscommunication. She could feel it. The officer motioned for her to follow him, and Lena took a steadying breath before stepping away from the gate. She was aware of the stares now, the silent judgment following her every move. She wasn't just a passenger being delayed. She was being treated like a suspect. As she was led down a corridor to a small, sterile room, Lena could feel her mind spinning. She couldn't let this happen, not now, not when everything was on the line. She had fought too hard to be here, to be successful. She wouldn't let this moment define her. But deep down, she knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't just be about the flight. This was about something much bigger, something that went beyond the security protocols and the misunderstanding. It was about the way the world saw her, the assumptions made about her, and how she would respond. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. The weight of her story. Lena followed the security officer through the narrow corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, casting a sterile glow on the dull, gray walls. The air felt thick with tension, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world that wasn't meant for her, a world where the rules didn't apply the same way to people like her. She had spent years building her company, climbing the ladder, making connections, and proving her worth. But now, at this moment, she was reduced to a mere suspect, as if her entire life's work could be erased by a single misstep, a single assumption. Her heels clicked sharply on the linoleum floor as the officer led her to a small, windowless room. The room was plain, almost clinical in its simplicity. There was a metal chair in the center of the room, and a small, unoccupied desk against one wall. A single security camera watched over the space from the corner, its red light blinking steadily. The door clicked shut behind her, and Lena felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over her. She hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't anticipated being treated like this. "Please, have a seat," the officer said, motioning toward the chair. His voice was neutral, but Lena could sense an underlying discomfort, perhaps a reflection of his own awareness that this wasn't normal, that something wasn't right. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, Lena stood for a moment, taking in her surroundings. Her mind was racing. Why had her boarding pass been flagged? What could have caused this? She had double-checked everything before leaving, her identification, her flight details, her itinerary. Everything had been in order. And yet, here she was, waiting in this cold room, treated like a criminal. The officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing her unease. "Ma'am, I know this may seem unsettling," he began, his voice lacking the usual cold detachment she had grown accustomed to in such situations. "But we are just following procedures. Your name has come up in a flagged list, and we need to confirm your details." Lena's heart skipped a beat. A flagged list? Her name? She had never been involved in anything even remotely illegal or suspicious. She had never been in trouble with the law, not even a speeding ticket. She had worked hard to maintain her integrity, her professionalism. This was all so out of the blue. "Flagged for what exactly?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with a hint of irritation. She wasn't going to let herself be steamrolled. Not this time. The officer didn't immediately respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a notepad, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. "There was a security alert tied to your name," he said, not meeting her eyes. It's related to an investigation that's currently ongoing. Your name was flagged by our system during a routine check." Lena's mind spun as she processed his words. "An investigation? What investigation? I don't even know what you're talking about." The officer glanced up at her, his expression pained. "I'm afraid I can't give you any more details at this moment. It's classified." Lena could feel the walls closing in. Classified? Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to maintain control. She wasn't about to let this be swept under the rug. She wasn't about to let them hide behind some vague, bureaucratic excuse. "Listen," Lena said, her voice firm now, "I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a businesswoman. I've worked my entire life to get to this point, and you're telling me that I'm somehow connected to an investigation I know nothing about?" The officer's silence was deafening. He didn't seem to have a response to her question, and Lena's frustration began to bubble over. The idea that she was being treated as if she were involved in something criminal, when she had done nothing wrong, was almost too much to bear. She finally sank into the chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She tried to steady her breathing, but the anxiety was starting to choke her. She thought about her company, her team, the future that had seemed so promising just hours before. What would happen if she missed this flight? What would happen if they decided to hold her for even longer? She thought of her family too, her mother, who had always told her to never let anyone make her feel small, to always stand tall in the face of adversity. Lena's mother had worked 2 jobs to put her through school, had sacrificed everything to give her daughter a chance at a better life. This was not just about her anymore. This was about standing up for everything her mother had taught her, everything she had fought for. "I'm not going to let this go," Lena said quietly, but with fierce determination. "I don't care what investigation you think I'm a part of. I'm a law-abiding citizen, and I've never been involved in anything illegal. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wrong. The officer looked at her, and for a moment, Lena thought she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words. He stepped to the side and dialed his radio, speaking into it in low tones. Lena's eyes narrowed as she watched him. This was far from over, and she wasn't going to let them hide behind their protocols or classifications. She sat there, waiting for what seemed like an eternity. Her mind raced with possibilities, with thoughts of what could be happening outside the room, what people were saying about her. She was sure her name had already been passed around the airport, whispered about behind her back. She could almost feel the weight of those whispers, the judgment, as if they were physical objects pressing against her. She refused to let them affect her, but it was hard not to feel the sting of their unspoken accusations. The door opened again, and Lena stood at attention, her back straight. This time, the security officer was not alone. Another man stepped into the room, this one wearing a dark suit and a stern expression. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, but his posture was just as rigid as the officer's. He was clearly someone in charge. A mess. Carter, the man said, his voice deep and authoritative. I'm the head of airport security. I've been informed of the situation. We're going to get this resolved, but I need you to remain calm while we clear things up. Lena didn't respond immediately. She didn't trust him, not yet. I've been calm, she said, her voice tight. But I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like I'm guilty of something. The man's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. I understand your frustration, he said. But I need you to understand that this process is standard procedure. We're just doing our jobs. Lena leaned forward in her chair, her voice low but filled with conviction. If this is just standard procedure, then why am I being treated like a criminal? Why is my name on some list I know nothing about? The head of security didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced at the officer who had been with Lena and then back at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, the officer spoke up. It's possible that your name was flagged due to an overlap with a similar name. There are thousands of people with the same first and last name as you. But until we confirm, we can't take any chances. Lena's breath caught in her throat. A name overlap? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This wasn't a security issue, it was a mistake, a careless one. And yet, here she was, caught in the middle of it. I don't have time for this, she said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to keep it steady. This is my career. My business. If you don't fix this, you'll have a much bigger problem on your hands. The head of security regarded her for a long moment before nodding. We'll get this sorted out, he said, but his words were still guarded. But you'll have to wait a little longer. Please be patient. As he turned to leave, Lena felt a deep sense of unease. Patience. That word had never seemed more loaded. She had always been patient, always willing to wait for the things that mattered. But this? This wasn't about waiting. This was about standing up for what was right. And Lena was done waiting. Unraveling the truth. Lena sat in the small, dimly lit room, her mind racing. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. The door had closed behind the head of security and the officer, leaving her alone with her thoughts. It was a strange kind of solitude, the kind that made the air feel thick and suffocating, as though she were trapped inside a bubble with no way out. But she wasn't about to be suffocated by this. She couldn't afford to be. Her future was at stake, and she had worked too hard to let something like this derail everything she had built. Lena crossed her arms, leaning back in the chair and staring at the sterile walls. The hum of the fluorescent lights was almost deafening in the silence. She had no idea how much time had passed, but every second felt like an eternity. It had only been a few minutes, yet the seconds had stretched and expanded in a way that made her question her very sense of time. How long could she sit here, waiting for answers that seemed to be slipping further and further out of reach? The more she thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. A name overlap? A mistake as simple as that could bring her life to a standstill? It didn't make sense. Lena wasn't naive. She knew how the system worked. She knew the biases and the implicit prejudices that plagued the world she lived in. But this wasn't just a bureaucratic mishap. This felt deliberate, like something had been set in motion long before she had ever stepped foot in this airport. She pulled out her phone again, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed a message to her assistant, Emily. Still stuck at the gate. Something's wrong with my boarding pass. They flagged me for something, some kind of investigation. I don't know what's going on. She hit send and put the phone back in her pocket, feeling the weight of her words settle into her chest. What could she even say? She had no answers to give. She had no explanation for what was happening. She had always been a woman of action, driven, decisive, never one to sit idly by. But now, she was just waiting. Waiting for someone to make a decision. Waiting for someone to tell her what she had done wrong. Waiting for the answers she was sure would never come. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the door. Lena straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening. She had been bracing herself for this moment, the moment when someone would finally come in and tell her what was going on. But even as she prepared for the confrontation, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would they finally admit it was all a mistake? Would they release her and send her on her way? Or would they find some other way to hold her back, to prove that the system had already made its judgment about her? The door creaked open, and Lena looked up to see the head of security step into the room once more. This time, his expression was more guarded, more serious. He wasn't alone. A woman in a black blazer stood beside him, her posture impeccable, her expression cool and composed. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes had a sharpness that made Lena's heart skip a beat. Ms. Carter, the head of security began, his voice tinged with a trace of apology, I apologize for the inconvenience. We've done a more thorough check, and it seems there was an error in the initial flagging of your name. Lena's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward slightly. An error, she repeated, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the woman standing beside him. She hadn't been introduced, but something about the woman's presence made Lena uneasy. What kind of error? The woman in the black blazer spoke for the first time, her voice smooth and professional, but there was something cold about it. We're not at liberty to disclose the exact details at this time, she said, her eyes flicking over Lena with the kind of calculated appraisal that made Lena bristle. But we've cleared up the confusion. It was a mistake on our end, and we'll be addressing it internally. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She had to stay calm. This wasn't the moment to lose her temper, not when she was so close to getting answers. She could feel the sting of frustration rising within her, but she pressed it down, focusing on what was being said. So, I've been flagged for something that wasn't even my fault? Lena asked, her voice sharp now. A mistake you made, and I'm the one who's been sitting here for God knows how long, treated like a criminal? The head of security nodded slightly, a tightness around his eyes suggesting he understood her frustration. I realize this has been an inconvenience, he said, his tone apologetic, but Lena wasn't sure she could trust his sincerity. We're committed to ensuring this doesn't happen again. Lena let out a slow breath, trying to keep her cool. And what about the investigation? She asked, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. What investigation was I flagged for? The woman in the black blazer glanced at the head of security before speaking again. As I mentioned, we can't disclose details of ongoing investigations. However, we can assure you that there was no intentional targeting of you. This was simply an administrative error, one that will be corrected. Lena's mind whirled with the implications of her words. An administrative error. But how could that be? How could her name, a name she had lived with her entire life, be flagged in the first place? And why did the woman's cold demeanor leave a nagging feeling in Lena's gut, a feeling that something was still being withheld from her? Are you sure there's nothing else? Lena pressed, her voice quieter now, as though she were trying to pull the truth from them. Nothing you're not telling me? The woman hesitated for a moment before answering, her eyes briefly flickering with something that could almost be mistaken for uncertainty. There's nothing more, she said firmly. I assure you, you're free to go. Your boarding pass has been cleared. We apologize again for the delay. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just transpired. It was over. It was finally over. She could finally board her flight, finally get to her meeting. The thought of it felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. But at the same time, the nagging questions in her mind refused to go away. Something about all of this didn't add up. The administrative error they had mentioned felt like nothing more than a cover-up for something deeper. Lena had no idea what that something was, but she knew that she couldn't walk away from this without answers. The woman in the black blazer gave a tight smile. We'll make sure this does not happen again, she said, her voice stiff and rehearsed. Lena stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling on her. She nodded but said nothing, her eyes briefly meeting the head of securities before she turned and walked toward the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt a strange sense of unease wash over her. It wasn't over. Not really. She was no longer a suspect in some convoluted, faceless investigation, but she was far from satisfied. The answers she had been given didn't sit right with her. There was more to this story, and Lena was determined to uncover the truth. As she stepped back into the bustling terminal, the noise of the airport hit her like a wave. The crowd, the chatter, the distant announcements, it all felt surreal. It felt like she had just walked out of one world and into another, one where everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same. She glanced at the time on her phone. She had just enough time to make the flight, but the events of the last hour lingered in her mind like an unanswered question. What had really happened? Lena knew she couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about a delayed flight. This was about a deeper injustice that had been done to her, and she would make sure that it was brought to light. The road ahead. Lena barely noticed the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floors as she walked toward her gate. Her mind was still spinning, processing the last few hours, hours that had felt like a lifetime. She had been cleared. Her boarding pass had been marked as legitimate. The mistake had been corrected. And yet, something gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she had been given were far from the truth. Something about the way the woman in the black blazer had spoken, the tightness around her eyes, the guarded manner in which they had handled the situation, Lena could tell that they weren't being entirely forthcoming. And she refused to walk away until she knew exactly what had happened. She arrived at her gate just as the boarding call was made, but her focus wasn't on the flight. It wasn't on the conference she was about to attend. It wasn't even on the career-changing deal that awaited her in San Francisco. No, her thoughts were consumed with the investigation. The strange, nameless investigation that had nearly derailed her trip. Who had flagged her name, and why? What was the connection between her and whatever investigation they were conducting? The more she thought about it, the more it seemed impossible that this was simply a case of mistaken identity. Lena knew she had to keep moving forward. She had too much riding on this trip, the company, her investors, her team, but she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that the people she had just encountered in that small room had been hiding something. They had been too eager to sweep her questions under the rug, too quick to reassure her that everything was fine. She wasn't fine. She was far from it. The line at the gate began to thin as passengers shuffled toward the boarding door, and Lena's attention snapped back to the present. She was next in line. The gate agent, a young woman with dark, curly hair and a bright smile, handed Lena her boarding pass with a nod. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. Enjoy your flight." Lena barely glanced at the pass before tucking it into her bag. She nodded curtly, a polite smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. As she walked down the jetway, her mind was still racing. She had to get through this trip. She had to stay focused, no matter what. Once inside the plane, Lena found her seat by the window and slipped into it, buckling her seatbelt without even thinking. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself. The rhythmic hum of the engines and the soft murmur of voices around her should have been calming, but all she could think about was the encounter at the airport. What had they meant by an investigation? Who had initiated it, and why had her name been caught in the crossfire? She had to know. She pulled out her phone again, glancing at her messages. Emily hadn't responded yet, which was strange. Normally, her assistant would be quick to reply, especially when something urgent came up. Lena quickly typed another message. "Emily, I need you to dig into something for me. I need to know if there's anything unusual connected to my name, anything that could have flagged me. I don't care how you do it, just find out what you can." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "This might be bigger than I thought." With a final glance at her phone, Lena slid it back into her bag and leaned back in her seat. The flight attendants went through their safety demonstration, but Lena wasn't paying attention. She was already deep in thought, replaying every moment from the past few hours. As the plane took off, rising into the cloud-streaked sky, Lena stared out the window, watching as the city below shrank into a blur. She had always been someone who thrived in high-pressure situations. Business deals, negotiations, even public speaking, none of it fazed her. But this was different. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that she hadn't in years. There were too many questions, too many things she didn't know. And Lena wasn't one to leave a question unanswered. Hours passed, and the time difference between the East Coast and West Coast seemed to stretch forever. The flight attendants served dinner, and passengers around her settled into the rhythm of the flight, some watching movies, others reading, some even dozing off. But not Lena. She wasn't about to let this rest. The moment the seatbelt sign flickered off, Lena stood and made her way to the back of the plane, where the flight attendants were preparing for their next round of service. She waited for a moment when the cabin was relatively quiet, then approached one of the flight attendants, a woman with dark brown hair tied neatly in a ponytail. "Excuse me," Lena said, her voice low and measured. "I need to ask you something. Did you notice anything unusual about the passengers at the gate? Specifically, the way they were treating me?" The flight attendant blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard by the question. But after a moment, she lowered her voice and leaned slightly closer. "I don't know what happened, but I overheard some of the gate staff talking before you boarded. They were a little tense. It wasn't normal." Lena's pulse quickened. Tense? In what way? The flight attendant glanced around to make sure no one else was listening before continuing. "It's hard to say. It's not like I've seen anything like it before. They were looking at your boarding pass a little too closely. They seemed to be making phone calls, checking something on their systems. But they didn't tell anyone what was going on." Lena's thoughts whirled. This confirmed her suspicions. It wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. Something, or someone, had targeted her. But why? "Thank you," Lena said, offering a small smile before turning to leave. She had just learned something important, and she wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. But it was clear now, someone had been watching her, had been keeping an eye on her movements. The question was why. Lena's seat was still empty when she returned, and she sank into it, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The mystery was deepening with every passing minute, and Lena knew that she was about to embark on a journey far more dangerous than the one she had initially planned. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about survival, about understanding who was behind this and what they wanted from her. As the hours stretched on, Lena's mind didn't stop racing. She had always been good at seeing the big picture, at understanding the forces at play in a situation. But this was different. This wasn't just corporate strategy. This wasn't just about money. This was personal. Someone had tried to sabotage her, and she would stop at nothing to figure out why. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Lena barely touched her meal, her thoughts consumed by the growing web of intrigue surrounding her. She couldn't shake the image of the gate staff whispering behind her back, their eyes darting toward her boarding pass. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was far more sinister at play. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Lena knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. She had no idea who was behind this, or what they wanted from her, but she wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let anyone stop her. The truth was out there, and she would find it. The hidden forces. The moment Lena's feet touched the ground in San Francisco, she was hit with a fresh wave of determination. The chill of the airport air was a sharp contrast to the warmth of her seat on the plane, but it was more than just the weather that made her shiver. It was the uncertainty that had followed her all the way across the country. The airport had been just the beginning, and she wasn't going to let it end there. She was supposed to be here for a meeting, to finalize a partnership that could secure her company's future. But now, it felt like that was secondary. The strange encounter with the gate agents, the feeling of being watched, and the cryptic comments from the flight attendants, all of it was building into something bigger. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't just a target by chance. Whoever was behind this had planned it all, and Lena was in their sights. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at it, seeing Emily's name pop up on the screen. The text was short, but it sent a jolt through Lena's chest. "Lena, I found something. It's not good." Lena's heart skipped. Not good. That could mean a million things. She quickly tapped on the message to reply. "What did you find?" There was a long pause before Emily responded, the word sending a chill down Lena's spine. "There's a corporation with your name in their system. Not just yours, multiple Lena Carters, but some of them are flagged under a special investigation. High-profile, intelligence-level scrutiny." Lena felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This wasn't a random flagging. Whoever had targeted her had been watching her for a reason. Her name, her very identity, had been linked to something far bigger than just a miscommunication at the airport. What kind of investigation? Lena typed quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she waited for Emily's response. "I'm not sure, but it looks like some kind of security clearance issue. But not the usual kind. This is deep. And there's something else, a project connected to these names. Some kind of covert operation." Lena's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. A covert operation? What did that even mean? Could she be tied to something she didn't even know about? The thought made her skin crawl. She had spent her entire career building a legitimate business, focusing on nothing but the future. How could she possibly be connected to something this dark? Before she could type another response, Emily's message came in, nearly making Lena drop her phone. "I'll send you everything I have. Be careful, Lena. This isn't just about you anymore. You've attracted attention. Big attention." Lena's stomach twisted. Big attention. The weight of the words sank deep, and suddenly, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. This wasn't some corporate mix-up. This was a well-orchestrated game, and she was a pawn in it. Her thoughts were interrupted as she stepped outside the airport, the cool San Francisco air greeting her as she looked for a taxi. She had to focus. The meeting was still a priority, but now, the stakes were higher. Everything was connected, and Lena knew she had to find the link. She hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, her mind whirling with the implications of everything Emily had uncovered. Whoever was pulling the strings behind this was clearly watching her every move. She had to keep a low profile. She had to be smart. The last thing she wanted was to escalate things further before she knew who was behind it all. As the cab sped down the highway, Lena took a deep breath and focused on the present. There was no time to waste. Her meeting was scheduled in less than an hour, and despite everything, she couldn't afford to miss it. But even as the cityscape of San Francisco loomed closer, Lena's mind was already strategizing her next steps. She needed answers. She needed to uncover everything Emily had found and more. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a set of files from Emily. She tapped on the message with urgency, her eyes scanning through the documents as the cab navigated through the winding streets. The files contained records, names, dates, and references to a mysterious government project codenamed Aegis. The project involved high-level security clearances, the kind typically reserved for intelligence agencies, and each of the flagged individuals had some connection to Lena's name. It was as if her very identity had been intertwined with something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Lena's pulse quickened as she continued scrolling. The further she went, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple investigation. It was a covert operation, involving corporate interests, security firms, and government agencies. And there, in the midst of it all, was her name, an anomaly, a link to something larger than herself. As the cab pulled up to the sleek, modern building where her meeting was to take place, Lena's thoughts were consumed with the dark web of connections she had just uncovered. Her career, her business, and her very identity were now entangled in something much bigger than a simple business deal. It was a web of influence and power, and Lena wasn't sure if she was the victim or a player in this game. She paid the driver and stepped out of the cab, the cold air hitting her face as she adjusted the collar of her coat. The building loomed before her, a symbol of success, of wealth, of opportunity. And yet, to Lena, it felt like a facade, a mask hiding something far darker. She entered the building, her heels clicking against the polished floors as she made her way to the elevator. Her meeting was in the penthouse suite, the highest floor, where deals of a different caliber were made. She took a deep breath as the elevator doors closed behind her, the hum of the machinery seeming to mirror the rapid thoughts racing through her mind. The closer she got to her destination, the more her resolve hardened. She would get the answers she needed. Nothing could stand in her way now. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to the top floor. As Lena stepped out into the pristine lobby, she was greeted by a receptionist who led her into a large conference room, where her potential partners waited. The room was sleek and modern, the large windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. But even with the breathtaking scenery, Lena couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being a part of something she didn't fully understand. Her mind flickered back to the files Emily had sent her: Aegis, government operations, covert investigations. The stakes had just become much higher. This meeting was no longer just about business. It was about survival. She took a seat at the conference table, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her as she prepared to face the people who had the power to change everything. The negotiations would begin, but Lena knew that the real battle was not going to take place in the boardroom. It would take place in the shadows, where secrets were hidden, and where only the strong survived. The crossroads of truth. The conference room was a modern spectacle of polished glass and chrome, with sharp angles and walls of windows that offered a breathtaking view of the San Francisco skyline. Yet, for all its beauty, it felt suffocating to Lena. The gleaming structures below seemed so far away, like distant memories she could no longer touch. The reality she faced was grounded in a much darker truth, a truth that had been building piece by piece ever since the mysterious flagging at the airport. As she sat at the head of the long, sleek table, Lena scanned the faces of the men and women seated across from her. The room was filled with high-powered executives and legal experts, all seemingly polished and at ease. They greeted her with practiced smiles, exchanging pleasantries as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the shadows of what had been unfolding behind the scenes hadn't already begun to reach into their world. Lena adjusted her blazer, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder containing the files Emily had sent her. She'd gone through them during the cab ride over, her eyes absorbing every detail. Aegis, the covert operation that had somehow connected to her. The names, the dates, the classified nature of the project. It was clear now, she was not just a passive observer in this drama. She was tangled in the middle of it, perhaps even more deeply than she realized. Her gaze fell on a man at the far end of the table, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with salt and pepper hair and sharp, calculating eyes. His presence commanded attention, even in a room full of powerful figures. This was Marcus Bennett, the CEO of the tech company that was the reason for Lena's presence here today. He was the one behind the partnership that she was supposed to seal today, a deal that could change the trajectory of her business. But what she didn't know was that Bennett was more than just a business mogul. He was a central player in something far more sinister. Lena shifted in her seat, her mind racing. What role did he play in this covert operation? Was he part of the larger scheme? Was he orchestrating this or merely another pawn caught up in the game? The questions were swirling, and every answer she sought only led to more ambiguity. So, Ms. Carter, Bennett's voice broke through her thoughts, smooth and polished. He leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking with hers. I trust your flight was comfortable? I hope there were no complications. Lena felt her stomach tighten. It was as if he already knew. Knew about the flagging, knew about the files. His casual tone was so at odds with the tension that had been building inside her for hours. She forced a smile, keeping her voice steady. The flight was fine, she replied, her tone deliberately neutral. But I'm afraid the journey has been a bit more complicated than expected. Bennett's lips curled into a knowing smile, one that made her skin prickle with unease. I can imagine. Travel these days, especially for someone in your position, is never simple. Lena studied him carefully. His words were laced with a kind of subtle challenge, a game of which she wasn't sure she was prepared for. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every second, every word exchanged was a chance to either move forward with the deal or expose something far more dangerous. But she wasn't going to let him lead this conversation. Not today. Perhaps we can get down to business, Lena said, pushing the folder aside and focusing on the documents in front of her. I've reviewed the terms of the agreement. Everything seems in order. If we're to proceed, we'll need to go over some key details, particularly regarding the tech infrastructure and intellectual property rights. The meeting proceeded in a whirlwind of corporate jargon, as Lena's mind drifted between the details of the deal and the dark web she had started to unravel. She knew that the partnership was important, that it could propel her business to new heights. But it was becoming increasingly clear that nothing about this meeting, or these people, was as simple as it appeared. Everything she had learned in the last few hours seemed connected to something far more insidious. She needed more information, more insight into the forces at play. And then, during a lull in the conversation, it happened. The door to the conference room opened with a quiet whoosh, and a man Lena had never seen before stepped inside. He was older, in his mid-50s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that immediately took in the room. His demeanor was calm, but there was an undeniable authority in his presence. Bennett's expression faltered for just a moment, but then he stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Ah, speak of the devil. Gentlemen, allow me to introduce James Alston. He's been monitoring our project from the other side. Lena felt a shiver of recognition, though she couldn't place it immediately. Something about the name rang a bell, but she couldn't recall where she had heard it before. Bennett extended his hand to Alston, and the two shook hands firmly. Lena watched closely, her instincts on high alert. Alston's eyes scanned the room with a practiced air, and for a moment, he locked eyes with her. There was something cold in his gaze, something detached and calculating. It didn't take long for Lena to realize, this man was part of the same puzzle, a part she hadn't yet seen. Alston nodded curtly to the room before turning to Lena. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. I understand there's been a little misunderstanding during your travels." Lena's heart skipped a beat. How could he possibly know about that? Was this all part of the plan? She forced herself to keep calm, not allowing her surprise to show on her face. "It seems I've been caught up in a series of events," she said coolly. "But I'm sure everything will be cleared up soon." Alston's lips curved into a tight smile. "I'm sure it will," he said, his words weighted with unspoken meaning. "But you should be aware, Miss Carter, that when you step into our world, there are no simple answers. Not anymore. Not for someone like you." The room grew eerily quiet. Lena could feel the weight of the statement hanging in the air, as if Alston had just exposed a truth she wasn't ready to face. Bennett, sensing the shift in tension, cleared his throat and motioned for everyone to take their seats again. But Lena's mind was already spinning. Someone like her? What did that mean? As the meeting continued, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every word spoken by Bennett and Alston felt like a cryptic clue, a piece of the puzzle that was leading her deeper into a labyrinth. Her name, her identity, had somehow become tied to a larger agenda, and she was now at the center of it all. But she didn't know how or why. And the more she tried to focus on the task at hand, the deal, the more it became clear that nothing would be as simple as it seemed. When the meeting finally wrapped up, Lena stood up slowly, her body tense. She had signed the preliminary agreements, but there was no satisfaction in the action. Not anymore. She had learned too much. And now, more than ever, she knew that getting the truth was the only thing that mattered. The deal, the partnership. Everything paled in comparison to what she was about to uncover. Bennett and Alston exchanged a few final words, but Lena barely heard them. Her mind was consumed with the unspoken truth that had hung in the air. Something was coming for her. Something big. And no matter how much she tried to escape it, there would be no going back. She walked out of the conference room, her pulse quickening. Outside the building, the cool evening air hit her like a wave, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm inside her. She needed answers. She needed them now. Lena's phone buzzed again. Emily's message popped up on the screen. "I've dug deeper. We were right. There's a reason your name keeps coming up, and it's bigger than you think. You're at the center of something that could change everything. Get out while you can." But it was too late. Lena knew that now. She was already in too deep.